I'm so delighted to be here with you, and what an honor it is to, it will be if I can get this out, to be here with you. I'm just delighted, and my bride, who could not be with us because she is working, who else would support me in the style to which I've become accustomed, Myrna sends her very best, and she said, you know, you must tell the folks, because they're Floridians now, you must tell the folks what happened this past weekend. I said, yeah, she said, tell them. They'll be interested in it. And it involves, one of the stories does involve, and you know, many of us are so interested in history. We've got a young man here, Michael is here. Michael, yell your last name out again, please. Parker. Michael Parker, very big time railroad buff and collector. We're just delighted that I'm delighted all of you are with us. It's just impossible to introduce everybody, so I hope you all understand that. But you know, we have an organization in Miami called Dade Heritage Trust. And Dade Heritage Trust does a wonderful job of saving and protecting buildings, and I'm very close with them. So last Saturday, we had to go down to Dade Heritage Trust, which, if you know Miami at all, is on South Bayshore Drive. Now, to get there, we live in Miami Shores, so you have to come down 95, you get off 95, and you have to go east on Southwest 8th Street. But coming back, since it's one way, you have to use Southwest 7th Street. Now, even in good times, it's difficult, because to get back on 95, and those of you from New Jersey know the old teacup handle routine, right? To get on the road. So that's the way it is. To get on 95 going north, you have to go under the overpass, come around, and do the teacup handle bit to get, well, ladies and gentlemen, it's under construction. My dear friends, as Daryl told you, I am only living in Miami now for a little bit over 73 years. I couldn't find my way onto I-95. I was really getting upset. And Myrna says to me, for God's sakes, will you calm down? She said, now pull over and ask that man who's walking over there how to get to 95. I pulled over, gave a little toot on the horn, put the window down. I said, sir, excuse me, sir. And he comes over, he looks in the window, he looks at me, he looks at Myrna. I said, sir, how do I get to 95? He looks again and he says, don't eat red meat. Now, all right, cheer up. The sad part of the story, though, occurred because we had to go to a funeral on Sunday, and you know, we have to go to funerals. And so we're there, a good friend, and the Paffords, I'm not going to mention his name because Jane and Tom are here, came over from Arcadia. We're honored by them being here. And they would know who it is. I'm not going to mention a name, but there's three of us who are good friends going back to high school. We're standing there in front of the coffin, and Ricky says, let me ask you guys something. What do you want people to say when you're lying there? Oh, Daryl, you forgot to ask people to turn off their cell phones. Off the cell phone, please, everybody. So Ricky says, what do you want people to say when you're lying there? And Charlie said, well, I want people to talk about what a great philanthropist I was, how I gave money to good causes, how I cared about people, and I looked after people. And then, of course, turned to Ricky and said, well, Rick, what do you want people to say? I want people to say what a great family man I was, how I took care of my family, how I was so loving and kind and good to them. And then, of course, they turned to me. Well, Seth, what do you want people to say? I said, well, I'll tell you, what I want people to say is, oh my God, look, he's moving. Now, ladies and gentlemen, those are wonderful stories, but that's not why we're here tonight. We're here tonight so I can tell you the real and true stories of the three greatest Floridians in the state's history. And we start off, usually people will say to me, well, you know, Seth, I'm not familiar with that name. But the first name that we have to address is a fellow by the name of General Henry Sanford. And Henry Sanford, starting to sound a little familiar, was born in 1823 in Connecticut. And he went to college, got his degree, and went into the diplomatic service, where he served in a number of posts, mostly in Europe, and became very well known. Well, he became so well known to President Lincoln that Abraham Lincoln made Henry Sanford his first ambassadorial appointment. He named him ambassador to Belgium. Well, shortly thereafter, the Civil War began. And so Henry Sanford is stationed in Belgium, becomes very friendly with the King of Belgium, but he's so close with President Lincoln that President Lincoln says to him, "What I would like you to do, Henry," and when I tell my students this at Barry University and Nova Southeastern, I say, "Don't worry, you're not going to have it on a test." He is told by President Lincoln that he is going to be, in addition to the ambassador to Belgium, he's going to be European ambassador without portfolio. And he, Lincoln, is naming Henry Sanford as American plenipotentiary to Europe. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, his job was to spread himself throughout the continent, to find out when shipments were being prepared to go to the Confederacy, to work out a group of spies and informants who would come back to him and say, "Mr. Sanford," he wasn't General Sanford yet, "there's a shipment leaving Liverpool, or there's a shipment leaving Hamburg, or there's a shipment leaving wherever it's leaving from, going to Charleston or Savannah." And Henry Sanford's job was to see to it that either that ship sank in the port or somewhere out at sea developed a leak and went under. And that's what war was all about. And he did a great job for the Union. He was a virulent abolitionist. The war is over. Lincoln is killed. We go through President Johnson, and then, of course, Ulysses S. Grant is named president. Grant was so fond of Henry Sanford that he names him head of Secret Service. They become very close friends. Eventually, 1868, Sanford decides that he would like to see this place that people are just beginning to talk about, a place down south, nobody knew anything about it, called Florida. And he comes down, he starts buying property. And eventually, he begins to bring in citrus. Ladies and gentlemen, you may not have been aware of this, and you know, my great law professor at FIU, Elio Bellucci, Professor Bellucci used to say, "Assume nothing." So I never assume anything with my audiences because many of you may be aware of this. Henry Sanford was the father of the modern Florida citrus industry. He brought from Italy, he brought from Spain, he brought cuttings, he planted, he developed groves, he brought in all kinds of various types of fruit, including the Valencia orange. And he is, by the way, in the Florida Citrus Hall of Fame. So he begins buying property. And among the properties he buys is what becomes known as the Sanford Grant. What is the Sanford Grant? Well, when I was teaching, I was adjunct professor of history at FIU, not the Osher, but I'm talking about regular undergraduate. And I used to tell them about the Sanford Grant. The Sanford Grant was approximately 14 square miles. That's a lot of square miles. I said, now think about it this way. This campus referring to the FIU, what's now called the Medique campus, is 1 square mile. It's 1 mile long along southwest 107th Avenue, 1 mile wide along Southwest 8th Street and Southwest 24th Street out to the Florida Turnpike. 1 square mile. I said, now picture that 1 square mile extending north for 13 more miles. And that's the size of the Sanford Grant. He, of course, bought more property. And eventually, a city was born. And we know that that city is the city of Sanford. And so there's more to the story because he becomes very friendly with the next Henry, who we're going to talk about in a few moments, a fellow by the name of Henry Bradley Plant. And General Sanford and Plant get along beautifully. And indeed, Sanford is placed on the board of PICO, the Plant Investment Company. And what happens is that it was Henry Sanford who convinced Henry Plant, and also putting a little money here and there, to build a railroad called the Sanford and St. Petersburg Railroad. And I know Michael's well aware of that railroad. And what happens, though, is that they're getting ready to break ground in 1880. Grant had been president, let me see if I remember correctly, 1872 to 76, 76 to 80, I think, or was he president 68 to, whatever it was, he wasn't president any longer, all right? Sanford is so strong with Grant that he extends an invitation to the former president to please come down. It's February of 1880. Florida is beautiful. And please come down and break ground for the railroad. And Ulysses S. Grant in 1880 becomes the first American president to enter Florida. So we have a great deal that we owe to the third of the three Henrys. And I already mentioned the second of the three Henrys, a fellow by the name of Henry Bradley Plant. Plant was born also in 1823. Had a little bit of a different track. He loved the steamboats. Now, I don't say steamships because the steamships are the big boats that run either coastwise from the Northeast all the way down to Cuba, or that go transit. Those are steamships. The steamboats are the little guys. We had steamboats on the St. Johns River, on the Ocklawaha River. We had steamboats. I mean, actually with the steam, they threw the wood on, and very, very interesting. That's another story for another time. But Henry Plant loved the boats, and he is able to finagle himself a job on one of the Connecticut River lines as a captain's boy. Now, what does that mean? I know that many of you go to the movies regularly, and I know that you see in the credits for the movies, it says best boy. Have you ever noticed that credit? And you say, what the hell does that mean? And then you see gaffer, right? Well, the gaffer, if we were in South Florida, we would say he would be the schlepper. He'd be the guy to be schlepping all the stuff, all right? What is the best boy? The best boy is actually the director's assistant. He is the number one. And if you remember on Star Trek Next Generation, that Captain Picard would refer to Commander Riker as number one. All right, so what you have now is the best boy in the movies is the number one guy for the director. The director gives him orders, he carries them out. All right, well, Henry Plant becomes a captain's boy, but not the best boy. In other words, he was there to do whatever the captain told him to do. If he said pull up the anchor, he pulled up the anchor. If he said carry the luggage, whatever he was told to do. And little by little, he learned more and more about that business. And eventually, he wanted to learn about the express room. And so he begins to learn the company is handling express packages. And he is fascinated by this. And he learns all about handling express, where it's coming from, where it's going, how to properly see that it's packaged, how to make sure it gets to its destination. And little by little, I mean, he works his way up eventually to become the head of Adams Express Company. And if you will Google, if we can use that term these days, Adams Express Company, you'll see that they were one of the major express companies in America. Well, Mr. Plant had worked himself up to positions of management, and Adams decides that they are going to open a major southern branch. And who do they assign? Henry Bradley Plant becomes the head of Adams Express in Augusta, and he is the head man. Well, what happens, though, is that he realizes that the express business is going to expand mightily as the railroads expand. So he begins making railroad investments. but not in the South. He starts in Texas and Arkansas, and then later on begins investing in railroads in the South. However, we come to the aforementioned event, the Civil War. And when the Civil War comes upon the country, President Jefferson Davis announces that any company doing business in the South must be incorporated in the South. So Henry Plant goes to see his bosses at Adams Express and says, look, we've got a problem. We have got to incorporate in the South. We've got to become a Southern company. So they said, well, what do you want to do, Henry? He said, look, here's what we'll do. You'll sell me the business at a very, very minimal price. We'll change the name to Southern Express Company. And then when the war is over, I'll sell it back to you, which never happened. So Southern Express Company comes into existence, and Henry Bradley Plant is such a genius. He goes to see Jefferson Davis, and he said, and also Judah P. Benjamin is Secretary of the Treasury. And he said, look, if you will make us the official carrier for the South, we will carry all of your government mails and packages, the government, at no cost to you. Who can turn down a deal like that? They agree to it. Now, there's a fellow from North Miami Beach, Brad Meltzer. You may have seen his stories on television. And he's got one story, and at Books and Books in Miami, the famous bookstore, he was going to be there. He's going to debunk or tell about the myths or the stories. And he starts talking about what happened to the Confederate gold. And he's giving this whole story. And we have somebody in Miami who I refer to as Miami's walking fountain of misinformation. And no matter what tour he's taking, whether he's walking or on the water, at some point, he brings the group close together and he'll point. And very conspiratorially, he'll say, that was Al Capone's hideaway. Oh my God. Al Capone didn't have any hideaways. He had a house on Palm Island in Miami Beach. He had no hideaways, okay? And here Brad is going over this and what happened to the Confederate gold, and we don't know what happened to the Confederate gold. And I put up my hand, he called, he said, yes, Seth. I said, Brad, we do know what happened to the Confederate gold. Henry Plant took it with him when he left to go to Europe with his wife about 4 months before. And they said, oh, well, Mr. Flagler. I said, Mr. Flagler, I'm talking about Henry Plant. So in other words, he didn't want to hear it because it wasn't what his theories told him. And the whole true story is right here in the Plant system of railroads, steamships, and hotels, which was co-authored with the great Professor Greg Turner, who's now at Florida Gulf Coast University. And this book, by the way, is it's not a biography of Henry Plant. It's the incredible story of the first industrial enterprise in the South. And that's what Henry Plant did. But he did more. There was another fellow whose name we may have heard of. And some of you may be aware that the first U.S. senator from Florida, 1845, happened to be a Jewish fellow. And his father, Solomon Levy, actually had slaves. Well, David Levy Yulie was a great proponent of statehood for Florida. And in 1845, in March, Florida gained statehood. David Levy Yulie is named the first U.S. senator from Florida. Well, this is great because later on he goes on to build the first cross-state railroad, which you may be aware of, from Fernandina to a little place called Cedar Key. And he's going to build a tremendous operation there. The problem was that Henry Plant came to him at some point, and he sent a letter. Henry Plant was a prodigious letter writer. He actually employed 6 secretaries simultaneously. Because remember, everything then was by hand. There were no typewriters yet. And so he wrote to David Levy Yulie, my dear Senator Yulie, I wish to make arrangements with you to gain trackage rights. Now, in railroading, trackage rights means that my railroad will pay your railroad to allow us to run to a given point over your railroad. So he writes this letter, and about a month and a half or 2 months go by, he doesn't get an answer. This disturbs him because he's the kind of man he expects to be answered. So he says, well, maybe it didn't get there. He writes a second letter. He never got an answer. And he got so angry, and you may have heard what he said, because he said publicly that by the time I am through with Cedar Key, pigs will wallow in your streets and owls will hoot in your attics. He then broke off all dealings with Senator Levy Yulie, refused to let Levy Yulie have an interchange so that his freighter passenger cars could operate on Plant's railroads. He went over Levy Yulie's Florida Railroad and decided that the great port on the west coast of Florida was going to be Port Tampa. And that is how Port Tampa came to be. Remember, Tampa has two ports. It's got Port Tampa and it's got the Port of Tampa. So there are two ports in Tampa. Port Tampa was built by Henry Bradley Plant. Plant begins to build and build and build and build on the West Coast. Now, you may or may not have heard the story. There was a meeting between Henry Flagler and Henry Bradley Plant. Nobody knows exactly what was said. It was held on Plant's yacht. They retired to the Salon at the rear. People saw them talking. Remember, they were good friends. Flagler was an investor in Pico, just as Sanford was. Nobody heard the words, but what they did know was that when that meeting was over, Henry Plant and Henry Flagler shook hands, and they agreed that we will never do what Gould and Vanderbilt and Rockefeller and all these barons building railroads in the East and the West were doing, getting into gunfights with the competition. Henry Plant agreed to stay in Central and West Coast Florida, Henry Flagler on the East Coast of Florida. Henry Plant died in 1899 with this enormous series of companies. What he had done, though, angered his wife and his son. Now, his wife was his second wife, because what he did was he left them a very minimal amount of money, and they were very upset by that. But what happened that we're really concerned with was the fact that Plant and Flagler had decided to merge their two steamship companies, the Plant Steamship Company and the Florida East Coast Steamship Company, into what became called the Peninsular and Occidental Steamship Company. And before Carnival and Royal Caribbean and Norwegian Caribbean, all this and all that, you wanted to go to Havana from Miami, you took the P&O SS Florida. Some of you might have done it, all right? That was how you got there. The docks in Miami were not Dodge Island. They were right there on Biscayne Boulevard. And some of you may remember that also. So they merged the two companies, and then in 1899, Plant died. Well, in 1902, the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, the Great Atlantic Coastline, came to Mrs. Plant and to Morton and said, look, we would like to buy the company from you. Everything but the hotels. We don't want the hotels. Fine. Well, we're going to offer you stock. She said, I don't want stock. I want cash. Sounded like a good deal at the time. Remember that the Atlantic Coastline never went into bankruptcy during the Depression. And with the mergers, can you imagine what that would have come down to for the family? The billions they would be worth today. But she sold it for cash. Why don't we hear the name Henry Plant the way we do Flagler? Of course there's Plant City, the Strawberry Festival. Of course there's Plant High School in Tampa. Of course there's Morton Plant Hospital, Plant's son, Morton. But wait a minute, the hotels are all gone, all except for the Tampa Bay Hotel, which is now the University of Tampa, and the Henry Plant Museum. All the rest of them are gone. All of the steamboats are gone. The railroads are gone. Because nothing is related to Henry Plant, unfortunately, but those few things. It was a lot different with the man who is the greatest single name in the history of Florida. And one man rises to that level, ladies and gentlemen. And Henry Morrison Flagler was born on January 2nd, 1830, in a little village called Hopewell in upstate New York, now called Hopewell Junction. It's Hopewell Junction because several railroads meet there. It's just like Yeehaw. Yeehaw did not become Junction because railroads met. It became Junction because 441, State Road 60, and the Turnpike met there. That's when it became Yeehaw Junction. Prior to that, it was the FEC's Kissimmee Valley branch that went through the great metropoli, you've heard of them, Illahaw, Nittaw, Hollapaw, Kenansville, and of course, Yeehaw. And so it was a whole different story. But Flagler begins to go to school, and somewhere around the age of 13 or 14, he says to his parents, you know, I'm not happy. I don't like it. I don't want to stay in school. So his father, an itinerant Presbyterian minister, says, well, Henry, you're going to have to learn a trade then. So he tries to learn several trades. He doesn't like any of them. And finally, he having been in touch with his half-brother, all right? They had different mothers, they had different fathers, same mother. Do I have that right? Let's see, Harkness, Stephen Harkness had a different father, same mother. That's what it was, all right? So Stephen Harkness was the father. So he's in touch with his half-brother. They get along very well. And finally, his half-brother says, look, why don't you come out here to Michigan? Dad will put you to work in the store, and we'll give you board and room. Well, how do you get from Hopewell, New York, to Michigan in about 1846? It ain't easy, because you have to go by boat, canal boat. You might go by stagecoach. You might walk part of the way. But eventually, he makes it out to Michigan. And the Harkness family puts him to work for the princely sum, ladies and gentlemen, of $5 per month. Listen, it's 1846. Money was different, right? So he goes to work, and here's the incredible part. He was so good with the trade, with the people coming into the store, that within 6 months, now think about this, within 6 months, his pay had been raised from $60 a year, $5 a month for 12 months, to $600 a year. Now, he's great with the people, but at the same time, he manages to fall in love with the Harkness' daughter, Mary. And eventually, when they were old enough, he asked for her hand in marriage. After asking Stephen Harkness for permission, he said, absolutely, I'd be happy to have you as my son-in-law. He stays there working, they get married, and after about a year or so, he goes to Stephen Harkness and he says, Dad, look, I really would like to go into business for myself. I will make a very good life for Mary. You know how much I love her. And Harkness says, that's fine. What do you need? He said, well, I need to borrow $30,000. Ladies and gentlemen, he promptly lost every penny. But unlike today, he paid back every penny. And then he and Mary moved to this great bustling town in northeastern Ohio, a little place called Cleveland, where he went into the same business, the grain, the salt business, and he became immensely successful. And one day he was, and by the way, you may not know this, but northeastern Ohio today remains a great salt dome. They're still taking salt out of northeastern Ohio. And one day he's down in his mines, one of his mines, and one of his young employees comes running up and says, oh my God, sir, oh sir, we've got a terrible problem. Well, sir, I don't, young man, calm yourself. Show me what the problem is. And the young fellow takes him over and he points and he says, sir, look at that. And coming out of the ground, ladies and gentlemen, was this thick, smelly, viscous, dark substance. And Henry turns to the young man and he says, young man, I will take care of it. Now, in Cleveland at that time, there were several people who were in the petroleum business, and they were good friends. And I know that many of you, and I know many of you may not be from Florida, but wherever you're from, and even now, I'm sure you get together with friends, and in the days you were in business, you got together with business friends, chambers of commerce, boards of trade, to talk business, right? You had a nice lunch, you talked business, you had a speaker. All right. Well, the same thing was going on in Cleveland at the time. And these three young fellows became very friendly. And they decided in 1867 that it would be one wonderful idea that instead of competing, let's cooperate, let's merge. And the problem was that they didn't want to listen to me because I told them at the time, the name you want to use is just, it's too long. Look at the length of it. It won't fit on the letterheads. It's just, but they went ahead anyway. And sure enough, what appears on the letterheads? It says Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler. And 3 years later, they decided that I was right. So, ladies and gentlemen, what did they change the name to in 1870? The Standard Oil Company. And that's where it all starts. John D. Rockefeller, in both his biography and his autobiography, states clearly that our success was due not to me, but to Henry Flagler. It was Henry Flagler's ideas, you've heard of them, the freight rebates, all of the great competitive things. Rockefeller states clearly it was a friendship built on business, not a business built on friendship. And so, or do I have it the other way around? Whatever it was the greatest friendship in the world. Rockefeller built his home, the Casements, right opposite Flagler's Ormond Hotel in Ormond Beach. All right, the Casements are still there. I think they're the home of the Ormond Beach Historical Society. Thank you. So what occurs is that, you know, those northern winters, just brutal. And Mary is having many problems. And Henry is getting more and more frantic. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? She's not well. And he goes to the doctors, and he doesn't want to try Lydia Pinkham's remedy. You've seen it on the wallpaper. The hell is Lydia Pinkham's? You know, you go in, you get that stuff in the mail from Dr. Sinatra and this one and that one. And research, what research? I don't see anything where you're telling me where to look for the research. Okay, snake oil salesman. All right, Lydia Pinkham's remedy. It'll cure pneumonia, it'll cure bad toenails, it'll cure cancer. Whatever you got, it'll cure. Well, you know how they cured it? Because when you had Lydia Pinkham's remedy, you know how it was made? They would fill the bottle with alcohol, not rubbing alcohol, drinking alcohol. And then you can't just give people alcohol, they would load it with sugar. You got to sweeten it up a little, right? Yeah, but remember what was legal at that time. At the top of the bottle, they would throw in a nice dollop of cocaine. And so, ladies and gentlemen, you took a swig of Lydia Pinkham's remedy, and oh man, did you feel good. Oh, yeah, but when you came down like a ton of bricks, all right? And he wasn't going to do that. And he said to the doctors, because remember, it was a different world. What can we do? Remember, if you had tuberculosis, if you had cancer, if you had a chest cold, everything was consumption. You had consumption. They didn't know what else to do. So what do they come up with? Well, Henry, we've heard about this place. What place? What place? We hear it's a place where summer spends the winter. Well, what are you talking about? We've heard about this place called Florida. Now, contrary to what you may have heard, notice how I'm phrasing that. He did not come to St. Augustine first. In 1878, he made his first trip to Florida with Mary, and where did he go? Jacksonville. Made his first trip to Jacksonville in 1878. Didn't like it. Grubby little town. It wasn't, but she started to improve. The problem was that he didn't come back until 1881. And when he came back, he went to Orange Park in Clay County, just a little bit to the west, a little bit south of Jacksonville. And by that time, though, it really was too late. And sadly to report, Mary would pass away later that year. Now, the woman who had been taking care of her nurse, whatever you called it in those days, Ida Alice Shords. Ida Alice was a wonderful woman. She had been loving and caring, and after a suitable period of mourning, Henry asked Ida Alice for her hand in marriage. What he didn't know at the time, ladies and gentlemen, and when I first heard about this wonderful school, sir, I'm going to throw in an advertisement, whether you like it or not. This school is doing so much for people who otherwise might be shunned, is helping people beyond words, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to tell you right now, I hope that you will, not only this, but I hope that you will speak with Gerald and our wonderful people here at this great school. And I have gone so far, because I'm at a great university founded in 1940 at Barry University, and I wrote the history of that school. But we have this outreach program to people who have the same issues, great people. And I have suggested to Darrell that perhaps the presidents of the two schools might find some common ground to work together. And I'm hoping that that might come to pass, all right? So at any rate, Henry marries Ida Alice, but he doesn't know that she's manic depressive. He doesn't know that, what's the other thing besides manic depressive? Bipolar, thank you. She's bipolar, and as they're together it gets worse and worse. He finally has no choice but to have her committed to what they used to call an insane asylum. He did, however, pay for her care for the rest of her life, all right? So what happens? While she is in the home, remember that he, in 1885, came to St. Augustine with Ida Alice on a delayed honeymoon. And in 1885, he looked around this wonderful little town called St. Augustine, and he said, I don't understand this. Why does this delightful little town not have a hostelry for people of my ilk? Now, let me explain this to you in the word ilk, because if we use that term today, Henry Flagler's ilk today might be people like Mickey Arison, Carnival Cruise Lines. How about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, or Steve Jobs and Bill Gates? How about Warren Buffett? These people would be Henry Flagler's ilk today, but this isn't today, this was then. So who was his ilk? Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Mellon, Gould, Fisk, Belmont, you know the names. And this was his ilk. And he was determined that he was going to build the most magnificent resort hotel in the world. And he began work in St. Augustine on the fabled Ponce de Leon, now Flagler College. And construction is going ahead for several months, and then his construction engineers, Mr. McGuire and Mr. McDonald, come to him. And Mr. Flagler, sir, we have bad news, and they're kind of nervous about approaching him. What do you mean you have bad news? What is the bad news? Sir, we're going to have to stop construction on the hotel. What do you mean you're going to have to stop construction on the hotel? What are you talking about? I pay every bill and I pay them immediately. Sir, please, sir. It's not because you don't pay. Sir, this rickety little narrow gauge railroad that comes down here from the south bank of the St. Johns River, sir, they put the ties right on the sandy soil. There's no roadbed. They're going off the track every day. The equipment is outmoded. Gentlemen, calm yourselves, please. I will go see Mr. Astor, not John Jacob Astor, another Astor. I will go see Mr. Astor, and indeed, we will see that we can work everything out. And he goes to see Mr. Astor. Oh my God, Mr. Flagler, we'll take care of everything. And a month later, guess who's back? McGuire and McDonald. Sir, he hasn't done a thing. Flagler goes back to him one more time, and he gets the same story. And he's had enough. And so on December 31st, 1885, Henry Flagler buys lock, stock, and barrel, track, ties, and roadbed, rolling stock, equipment, locomotives, freight, and passenger cars, the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Halifax River Railway. Henry Flagler is now in the railroad business. But not because he wants to be in the railroad business, only because he has no choice. It's at that point that he brings in several very talented people to work with him. Among those were Joseph R. Parrott, who had been with Mr. Plant. And Mr. Plant gave his approval for Mr. Parrott to become vice president for Mr. Flagler for the railroad operations. And he took over, and boy, did he get things going. And they became very close friends. And then one day they're out walking on King Street in St. Augustine, if you know King Street, and Mr. Parrott says to Mr. Flagler, that open site right across King Street from the Ponce de Leon, he said, you know, sir, every person in America who can afford to pay $13 or $14 a night will be staying with us. But sir, I want to attract those people who can't quite pay that, but they can pay $11 or $12 a night. And I want to have them come because I want to fill the trains. Mr. Flagler said, well, that's not a bad, let me think about it. A couple of days later, he calls in Mr. Parrott. He says, we're going to build the hotel across the street. I want to call it the Alcazar. Now the St. Augustine City Hall, the Leitner Museum of Hobbies, the fabled indoor pool, which became the Antique Mall, and the restaurant, fabulous. And they get busy on that. And they're out again walking. And there's a hotel almost completed just to the east of the Alcazar. And it was under the name of the Casa Monica. Guess what? It's the Casa Monica again. But Mr. Flagler decides, look, I liked your idea. We're going to now attract everybody who can pay $11 or $12 a night, or $13 or $14, but let's attract everybody who can pay $9 or $10 a night. I'm going to buy the Casa Monica. We're going to change the name to the Cordova. And now Mr. Flagler has 3 hotels at St. Augustine. Well, you know, he's a big man. And so it's time for the hotels to open. However, we're going to put off the opening until January of 1888. Why? Because we're working now with our friends at the Pennsylvania Railroad. We're working with Mr. Plant, who controls a number of railroads on the East Coast. And anybody here from Baltimore? Any Baltimorean? You're from Baltimore, hun? Huh? Baltimore, hun? Right. Yeah. Baltimore, hun. Okay. Well, you know then the great Walters Art Museum. And one of the great names in American history is Mr. Walters and his family, who owned the Atlantic coastline of railroads, which would become the Atlantic coastline. So Mr. Flagler gets together with his friends from the Pennsylvania Railroad, with Mr. Walters, with Mr. Plant, and they decide that on January 13th, they are going to operate from Exchange Place Terminal in Jersey City. Seth, why not Pennsylvania Station? Because Pennsylvania Station did not open until 1909, and the engine and cars weren't going to float across the Hudson River. And so they decide that they're going to run the first trip of the all-Pullman sleeping car, New York and Florida special. Oh my God, what do you say? Except they're going to do something else. This is going to be the first fully vestibuled train ever to run in America, and equally as important, ladies and gentlemen, remember in those days you went by train, you had the gas lines, or you had the wood-burning stoves at the end of the car. Imagine what happened in an accident. This was going to be the first electrically lighted passenger train to run in America. And on January 14th, the train pulls into St. Augustine at twilight. Now, you know what twilight's like. You know, it's not quite dark. It's getting dark. It's getting harder to see. And everybody steps up, and it's twilight. It's hard to see what's going on. And all of a sudden, Mr. Flagler steps forward, looks at the Ponce, goes like this, and 1 million light bulbs go on. 1 million. Imagine, 1888. The gas, everybody's writing in their diary. Everybody kept a diary or journal in those days. They are going absolutely wild. Well, You can imagine, and many of you who have lived here a long time, I mean, listen, we came here, and it's true, you could have rolled a bowling ball down Collins Avenue in Miami Beach during the summer and not hit a car, okay? It was an entire winter resort state, all right? They had a fabulous season, absolutely fabulous. The season comes to an end, it's mid-April, they're closing down, and two young men are shown into Mr. Flagler's office, Mr. Anderson and Mr. Price. And Anderson and Price are shown in, and Mr. Flagler says, well, what is your business, gentlemen? Well, Mr. Flagler, you may have known that we built the Ormond Hotel. And sir, where you've had this wonderful season, sir, the entire season, we thought you were going to build the railroad down to Ormond and Daytona. And sir, for the entire season, we had 101 room nights. That's the equivalent of one person staying one night 101 times. Sir, if you don't extend the railroad for the next season, we're going to have to abandon the hotel. Mr. Flagler says, gentlemen, please don't act hastily. Mr. Parrott and I will come down, we'll take a look, and I'm also going to bring my new land commissioner, James Ingraham. If you're familiar with Miami, you know the Ingram building, all right? And James Ingraham, Mr. Flagler, Mr. Parrott, go down to the Ormond, where they're met, of course, by Anderson and Price. And Mr. Flagler says, gentlemen, if you'll speak with Mr. Anderson, Mr. Price, I want to look at the hotel. And he does. He plunges into the bowels of the hotel, inspects the boiler rooms, the kitchens, the dining rooms, every part of the hotel, gone for 3 hours. When he comes back down, he waves at Ingraham and Parrott. They come over to him. He whispers something. Mr. Parrott comes back over and he says, gentlemen, Mr. Flagler says to tell you that we will be in touch. They don't know what, they don't know when. 2 days later, they get a telegram. And the telegram says, please arrange, come to St. Augustine, earliest appropriate time. 2 days later, they're shown into Mr. Flagler's office. And he stands up behind his great desk. He puts his hands on the desk. He stands up and he says, young men. And you say, Seth, how do you know what he said? Because, ladies and gentlemen, that conversation happens to be documented. We know every word in that conversation. The secretary wrote down every single word starting with young men. And he said, young men. And by the way, you say, well, still, how do you know that? You were told I'm the only person in the country who bears the official title of company historian with an American railroad. I maintain our company's historic files. Not a bad deal, huh? Okay. So, young men, I have come to a decision, and they're on pins and needles. What is the decision? Yes, I will extend my railroad to Ormond and Daytona, but only if you sell me the hotel and remain on as my managers. And Anderson and Price remained with Mr. Flagler for close to 30 years, managing the Ormond. Now, shortly thereafter, and I should have told our friends at Beacon, I should have said, you know, I need a big Florida map. So you're going to now use your great imaginations, because Mr. Flagler calls in Mr. Ingram and Mr. Parrott, and he's got his map of Florida here, and it shows the railroad extended down to Daytona. But he's drawn a circle way down here. He says, gentlemen, I want you to make arrangements for us to go to this place. Mr. Flagler, gentlemen, kindly arrange it. And they did. And by boat and by buckboard. Remember the buckboards, the low-sided, horse-drawn wagons that usually had 2 rows for passengers? They carried freight. So by boat and by buckboard from Daytona, they come down, way down to this island, way down the coast. And they come in, and Mr. Flagler says to Mr. and Mr. Parrott, you'll wait for me on that, where the broken down sign that says inn is. And sure enough, he plunges into the underbrush. And about 2 hours, they're getting worried. 2 hours later, he comes out. They were getting ready to call for help. He says, gentlemen, you will make arrangements for us to buy this place. But Mr. Gentleman, kindly arrange it immediately. And they did. They bought that place. Today you know it as Palm Beach. And Henry Flagler bought Palm Beach and extends the railroad, builds the two great hotels, the Royal Poinciana, the Breakers, and the story then is done, folks. Well, not exactly. It's, this story is of confluence and coincidence. It is so incredible because about 65 miles south of Palm Beach, there was this maniacal, fanatical, hysterical pair of women who were absolutely insistent that Henry Plant extend his railroad across the state of Florida to this little nothing of a village on the shores of Biscayne Bay. And they kept, and finally he said, Madam, stop bothering me, I'm not going to do it. Not the least bit concerned. We're going to turn to Mr. Flagler. They start writing him. Nothing happens until the great and terrible freezes of December of 1894 and January and February of 1895. You can see that we're moving along in time. Darrell, do I have a couple of more? Is it okay, folks? Can I have a couple of more minutes? Is that all right? Okay. So the great and terrible freezes, December of 1894 and January and February of 1895. Now we're going to debunk the biggest and worst myth, worse than the Al Capone nonsense, in Miami history. Ladies and gentlemen, Julia Tuttle never sent Mr. Flagler orange blossoms to get him to extend the railroad to the shores of Biscayne Bay. That is nonsense. It's a fable. It's a fairy tale. Or as we would say in French, it's a boubamaisie. Okay? It has no basis in truth or fact. All right? So what did happen? The freezes destroy everything to the freeze line, which after 61 years of research, I seem to have been able to lock it in, not an exact place. Now listen to the distance though. It looks to be that that freeze line was within 1 mile north or 1 mile south of today's Broward Boulevard, which was not there in Fort Lauderdale at the time. All right? Everything south of there was verdant and lush and green. And Mr. Flagler gets a telegram from Julia Tuttle. Region around shores of Biscayne Bay, untouched by freezes. Please come and see. He didn't come, contrary to what he did not come and see. He sent Mr. Ingram and Mr. Parrott. They brought back to him boxes of truck of produce, 2 citrus tree limbs wrapped in wet cotton. We don't know if it was orange, grapefruit, tangerine. We don't know if it was lemon or lime. 2 citrus tree limbs. When they got back, he looks, he says, my God, are you sure? Sir, you sent us down there. We're reporting to you what we found. And it's at that point, he sends the telegram to Mrs. Tuttle. And the telegram says, Madam, what is it that you propose? And that's when she writes back the famous letter. My dear Mr. Flagler, if you will extend your railroad to the shores of Biscayne Bay and build one of your great hotels, and here's the key and most important part of the letter, then in addition to the lands already promised you by Mr. and Mrs. Brickell, who had begun promising him land years before Mrs. Tuttle had, then in addition to the lands promised you by Mr. and Mrs. Brickell, I will give you half of my holdings south of the river plus 50 acres for shops and yards. With that, a contract was drawn up, a deal was made. But understand, remember in those days, the Transcontinental Railroad was built because the government gave the railroads land, right? What do you think it was like in Florida? The Florida Internal Improvement Fund gave the railroad alternate sections on most of the right-of-way. The railroad went in, Mr. Ingram, the land commissioner, and arranged to buy or have donated by the landowners the rights-of-way. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Flagler extended the railroad to the shores of, not because how'd she get them to him? What'd she do, send them by FedEx overnight? I mean, ridiculous. They got land, thousands and thousands of acres of land. That's why Mr. Flagler extended the railroad to the shores of Biscayne Bay. The first train, a construction engineer's train, arrived on April 15th, 1896. The first passenger train arrived on April 22nd, 1896. The first excursion train from the north arrived on May 11th, 1896. On July 28th, 1896, without ever having been a village or a town, incorporated area of any kind, Miami springs into existence as a city. And on December 31st, 1896, not in 1897, On December 31st, 1896, the great and fabled Royal Palm Hotel opens on the banks of the Miami River. Sadly to report, 2 years later, Julia Tuttle died of influenza. There was no cure. My mother's mother, of course, I never met her. My mother was 9 years old, and in 1925, my mother's mother died of influenza. Well, the story continues because we know about the great Keywest extension. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the first and only complete history of the Keywest extension. And let me tell you, it really is a terrific book. And by the way, just because I wrote it doesn't mean it isn't a terrific book. So, at any rate, we know the story. Mr. Flagler, and the whole story's in there, but suffice to say, the railroad reaches Key West on January 22nd, 1912. The story of whether or not he said, "Now I can die fulfilled," we don't know that he actually said that. What we do know that he said is he was being led down the path to the reviewing stand, and the children were throwing roses at his feet and singing. And he said to the mayor and to the admiral, he said, "I cannot see the children, but I can hear them singing." And then he returned to Palm Beach to continue working. Now remember, he built Whitehall for his third wife, Mary Lily Keenan Flagler, from the great Keenan family in North Carolina. And he built that between 1899 and 1902 because she wanted just a little cottage like they had in Newport. And between 1899 and 1902, it only cost him $2 million. And what's $2 million? So, at any rate, he goes back, and if any of you have been to Whitehall, the Flagler Mansion, what I want you to do, if you do ever go, they're going to tell you that Mr. Flagler fell, the fatal fall, on the great marble staircase. Not true. What I want you to do is say, "Excuse me, show us the door to his private staircase to the left side under the great staircase." And I'm telling you this is going to happen because it's happened twice. People have reported back to me. They said, "You took Professor Bramson's class, didn't you?" Well, ladies and gentlemen, on May 20th, 1913, Henry Flagler died. 2 days later, every locomotive, every passenger train, every freight train, every piece of equipment, every man stood still and at attention for 10 minutes to honor the memory of Florida's empire builder. Now, let me ask you all one question. Is there anybody here who believes in reincarnation? You may say, "Seth, what is that?" You're not going to be embarrassed. Is there anybody here who believes in reincarnation? Okay, you can be honest. No, you're not going to be embarrassed. The reason I ask is because, ladies and gentlemen, I am married to the reincarnation of Henry Flagler. And you say, "My God, what are you talking about?" I just told you that Mr. Flagler died on May 20th, didn't I? 1913, right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, Myrna was born on May 20, but not 1913. My dear friends, it has been such a privilege, a pleasure, an honor to be with you. Thank you all so very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen,